Hey folks, it's Stefan, back again with another episode of the Gamer's Companion to Music. Today we're going to tackle a series I've just recently gotten into, the daunting Dark Souls 3. The series is known for its difficulty in punishing bosses, but the music finds a way to channel the dark nature of the story into meaningful moments throughout the game, even though most of the game is completely devoid of music. Let's explore the transitory lands of Lothric and the music that awaits within. Dark Souls 3 was my first entry in the series that I played beginning to end. I got bodied pretty hard in Dark Souls 1 and I gave up, but I persevered through 3 since I spent the money on the game. At some point the mechanics just kind of clicked for me, and I understood how to successfully survive most of the time. You'll see a lot of gameplay here where I'm summoned into other worlds as a phantom, so while I'm still a scrub lord in-game, the music struck me each and every time I heard it. The general gist of the game is that you're an undead called an Unkindled, and your job is to return the 5 Lords of Cinder to their thrones in FIRELINK Shrine, so that the fire can be linked once more, and the cycle of fire can continue. You explore the transitory lands of Lothric in search of the Lords of Cinder, slashing and mostly rolling through many undead along the way. If you want more information on the lore, go research it on the wiki. It's very, very in-depth, and there are a lot of important things to consider about the story that happened before the events of Dark Souls 3. That's the part I'm not an expert on. The music part, however, is much more up my alley. The music for Dark Souls 3 was composed by a team of composers. They include Yuka Kitamura, the composer of Dark Souls 2 and Bloodborne, Tsukasa Saito, Motoi Sakuraba, who composed Dark Souls 1, and Nobuyoshi Suzuki. The music is fully orchestrated and was performed beautifully by the Tokyo Philharmonic Orchestra. There is also a full complement of choral voices included in the score, and they play a gigantic role in the tone and texture of the music. The first interesting thing about the music is that the music only plays during certain cutscenes and boss encounters. There really isn't any music that plays during normal gameplay. This is notably different from all of the other games I've covered in the GCM videos. The game does require a good amount of focus and coordination to play well, especially as a newcomer. Yet this silence speaks out more than music would. Each tentative step I took, accompanied by a deafening silence, only accentuated the difficulty. What it also does is add a sense of importance to the boss encounters. The game has a very dark tone to it, so the music needs to accentuate this as well. Even from the title theme, you'll hear exactly what the game is going to bring in terms of the score. We hear a full chorus singing the extended phrases while the orchestra and strings give us the sense of rhythm that drives the music forward. This will be a recurring theme in the music that we discuss in this video today. The strings serve 2 purposes, the first being textural and rhythmic accompaniment, and the second being important soloistic melodic instruments at times. We hear both of these in the title theme. The minor chord texture also represents the tone of the music throughout the game. Listen to a portion and see if you can't hear the roles each group of instruments are playing. The opening cinematic gives the player an introduction to the story with a beautiful narration. It's confusing to a newcomer, but the music seems to have clearly been written to accompany the pace of the story. The music picks up in intensity when the Lords of Cinder are first mentioned, and continues to strengthen up until the point the screen hard cuts to black after Yorm the Giant rises from his grave. The FIRELINK shrine makes its return in Dark Souls 3, albeit in a different physical composition from Dark Souls 1. The start and stop of the strings give a slight somber feeling, possibly attempting to convey the sense of the Lords of Cinder who have abandoned their thrones. This is one of the only places in the game that music will play while you're controlling your player character. The physical location is a respite from your battles, yet the music reminds us of the nature of your situation. One of the main attractions of the Dark Souls series are the boss fights. We've seen great ones and we've seen terrible ones, and Dark Souls 3 is no exception to either end of the spectrum. All of the boss fights are listed on the screen. I'll be covering as many as I can, but definitely going out of order based on my own personal views of the music. Feel free to agree or disagree with my assessment of the music, but always try to listen for what the music is actually doing. It's there, in my opinion, that the true beauty of the score comes to light. All but one of the bosses have two phases to their fight, the exception being the Ancient Wyvern. Phase 1 is the first iteration of the fight, and Phase 2 is when most of the bosses say, screw this, let's use all of my power against you. And that's where the fights become notably more difficult. The music also changes from Phase 1 to Phase 2 in very interesting ways. Some of the pieces really ramp up in instrumentation and intensity, while others do the exact opposite. It was very interesting to pinpoint which of the fights do which in their second phase. To start, we'll explore Iudex Gundyr, the first boss you'll find in the game, even before you discover the FIRELINK shrine. The music is driven by the strings and accentuated by percussion hits throughout. The chorus joins in with an important statement as the rhythm bows out before the two combine majestically. This music is in 3/4, which essentially is just a triple feel, instead of a double or duple feel we hear in most music. The key changes and the harmony starts to progress faster, although the music isn't too terribly different from the first phase. We just hear more of the orchestra start to come in. It really changes partway through Phase 2 when the low strings and timpani pick up the rhythmic intensity and start to change the tone of the music. It's a pretty interesting change as the demon-like creature continues to attack you. A very interesting fight musically is the fight against the curse-rotted GREATWOOD. Yeah, you actually fight a tree. It took me by surprise when this huge tree in the corner of the room turned around and started attacking me. This is the first piece of music to start employing the choral voices in a very individualistic way, as if these possessed souls are trying to cry out through the music. It's a very strong and poignant effect that creates a layer of depth to the music, while the strings play a very atonal melodic figure through the first phase. You'll know that you're in Phase 2 because the tree will have booty slammed the floor of your room into submission well before this point. There's a very horrifying organ entrance that transitions us into the second phase of the music. There's so much dissonance in the chorus that it's hard to even recognize anything melodic that's going on. I know there's some small stuff in there, but I find that it's mostly meant to create a frightening texture. What keeps the music moving forward is the rhythmic hits you hear in what is probably a combination of organ and strings. It's messed up, but incredibly effective. Now that we've successfully succeeded in feeling unsettled, we're going to move to two of my favorite pieces of boss music that do the exact opposite thing. The first is the infamous Pontiff Sullivan. You encounter him in a cathedral in Irithyll of the Boreal Valley, and is considered by some to be the toughest boss fight in the game. The music is notably restrained, especially in the first phase. The melodic statements very loosely mirror those in the title theme at times, but the chorus and orchestra barely use any of the low timbre instruments, so the music has a lighter feeling to it than those pieces we've heard before. The use of organ and chorus is very similar to a sound you might hear from a composed mass, so I think that the music conveys more about the setting than the actual fight itself. Phase 2, however, really ups the ante in terms of instrumentation and intensity. There is such a beauty to the chord progression in the second phase. It uses a lot of suspended tones to create a sense of important resolution. When the music resolves to a new chord, it sounds and feels important and meaningful, as if this was the only place the music could possibly go. This is a huge credit to Kitamura, who composed this specific piece. I'd really like to hear this in an actual cathedral. I bet its majesty would be unparalleled. Personally, my favorite piece of music in the entire game is the music playing when you fight the Dancer of the Boreal Valley. It does something that not a lot of boss music in games does. It holds back. It was composed with elegant restraint. I think the simple elegance of the music fits the elegance of the dancer's movements, as hard as they may be to dodge. The music in Phase 1 is very simple. It takes a single pitch and the melody pivots around that pitch, slowly getting farther and farther away from it. The orchestra only uses the higher-pitched instruments and voices in Phase 1, and it's very effective. It's a deliberate injection of serenity in a game where serenity is wholly not on the menu. Phase 2 begins with a stark entrance of disturbed voices, followed by a more full arrangement of this melodic figure we hear in Phase 1. It's not an exact copy, but the motion is very similar. Along with the melody this time is a more sustained choral presence of the pitch that the music pivots around. It feels like the voices are crying out this time as opposed to just singing along. It might just be the dissonant nature of the choral parts, but it works well, and I really think it fits the idea of the dancer slowly setting the room on fire. It's a beautiful piece of music. Speaking of music that shows restraint, let's move now to the Lords of Cinder themselves. Farron's Undead Legion, the Abyss Watchers, has one of the most somber tracks of music in the game. The solo female voice on top of the texture really brings out the somber tone of the track, and while the rhythm does pick up, the music doesn't lose its identity. It's also one of the few boss themes that's primarily melodic, as opposed to being about texture. I was honestly expecting to hear something very ambitious and bombastic when I encountered the first Lord of Cinder. However, just the opposite occurred. I think that many in the Dark Souls community found this piece of music to be quite meaningful. The second phase does something only a few of the boss tracks do. It completely strips down the texture. It's even more somber now than it was before, especially with the low strings accenting the melody with the voices. It's really a stunning piece of music, and it almost might make you question if what you're doing is really the right thing. Maybe that's just me. The next Lord of Cinder you'll find is most likely Yorm the Giant. I was disappointed in this fight from a gameplay standpoint, but I guess if I really wanted to, I could use a different weapon against him. The music fits the character of a giant though. It's very heavy and sounds big. The fullness of the orchestration is what makes it sound this way. The chorus uses mostly its male voices and is accented by the low brass to make the music feel more heavy and bombastic. This is more in line of what I was expecting from the Lords of Cinder in terms of music. Phase 2 is actually very similar to Phase 1 musically. We hear much more action in the high strings, playing a chromatic ostinato, or repeating pattern. The female voices are heard throughout in conjunction with the texture we've heard before. The whole fight is very similar, but most likely you won't hear much of the music since you'll wreck his you-know-what with Storm Ruler. The last Lord of Cinder is ALDRICH, Devourer of Gods. You'll find him in Anor Londo. Yes, the same Anor Londo from Dark Souls 1. The only god that's confirmed to have been devoured in the lore is GWYNDOLIN, once again from Dark Souls 1. All of this is actually important to the music. Listen to the theme of Dark Sun GWYNDOLIN and the Moonlight Butterfly from Dark Souls 1, and then listen to the music of ALDRICH from Dark Souls 3. Yeah, that's pretty cool, right? I'd imagine if you played Dark Souls 1, you might have even thought about this when you heard it in the game. What's essentially happening is a fairly dark reorchestration of the instruments around the choral melody. It sounds a lot more frightened and desperate in Dark Souls 3, especially moving into Phase 2. This part adds much more of the orchestra together with some really intense low-range sustain notes. It also sounds like there's a high voice on a static pitch crying out. It's really quite creepy. The music is very powerful, especially considering that the melodic material is just an alteration of pre-existing music from Dark Souls 1. There are two themes that employ a more regal quality, and both exist at the Lothric Castle or the High Wall of Lothric. DRAGONSLAYER ARMOUR exudes a very heavy presence, since he's pretty much nothing but bulky armor. We hear an interesting musical technique called hemiola in this piece. Hemiola is when two groups of 3 beats are replaced by 3 groups of 2 beats. Most of the time it's alternating, so you'll hear it a little bit like this. 1 2 3 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 1 2 da 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 1 2 1 2 3 1 2 1 2 3. This creates a very prominent rhythmic drive. You hear it a ton in the Pirates of the Caribbean soundtrack. I'm not trying to compare the two, but most people have seen the movie. Phase 2 gets very, very interesting here. The music changes completely. I mean, we start to hear major chords? We start to feeling a sense of uplifting quality in the music? What the hell is going on? I think that what's happening is the music is trying to add weight and depth, but it's a pretty odd change. I mean, it's a great piece of music on its own, but I remember being somewhat confused when hearing it in context. VORDT of the Boreal Valley is your first boss after the FIRELINK shrine. This is one of the few tracks that the brass instruments really shine and add a regal color to the music. It's still very dark, but they're much more prominent. Phase 2 picks up the tempo and adds to the same feeling. It's more intense, but it's honestly not that much different from Phase 1. Lastly, I'd like to point out that in my own personal opinion, the music in Phase 2 of Lothric and Lorien's fight is way more conclusive than the music in the Soul of Cinder as standalone music. I mean, just listen to how epic the Lothric fight music is. But in the context of the game, the music at the end of the final fight against the Soul of Cinder is much more appropriate, since it quotes the piano motif from Gwyn's theme in Dark Souls 1, who was the first to link the flame. It's a very good example of intentional choice in music selection. Dark Souls 3 has a lot of great music in it. The thing that struck me the most about the music in this game was not the composition, but the intentional choices the composers made about the music. It's not always about what fits the fight, it's about what fits the moment. This is where, as I'm sure you've heard by now, Dark Souls 3 excels. Now, of course, there's some other great pieces of music I haven't covered today. But whether you've played the game or not, I hope that you can agree with me that the music is representative of the world it exists in, if nothing else. And with that, we put a close on this episode of The Gamer's Companion to Music. As always, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Want more GCM? Check out the playlist here and let me know which game I should do next.